Welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I started an eco conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, Oxford Clay, I don't just make pottery, I also make books and courses for other potters who want to be more environmentally friendly in their pottery making. And that's what this podcast is all about. And I can't wait to get started. Let's go. Hello, welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm your host, Catherine Tomlinson. Thank you so much for joining me today on today's episode. So we're going to be talking about three ways to use a pottery class if you're like attending pottery classes or you're thinking that you might want to attend pottery classes. I thought it'd be quite an interesting episode to do on kind of different ways of conceptualizing the time spent in a pottery class because it's going to sound like a really weird episode to do, but basically, I thought it'd be good to do because I used to go to pottery classes and I used to go in with this thought that was like, if I don't like produce something, like when I went to pottery classes, I was quite young and they were quite expensive. And so I was thinking, okay, so I don't, I want to get the maximum value out of these classes. And I thought if I don't make something out of these classes, almost like seeing it as like I've paid for the thing that I'm going to make. So if I don't make something, the outcome, then they're kind of like, like a waste of money or like a waste of time. I didn't think of them more like kind of, the nothing is a waste of time and that you're always growing and learning and stuff. So I thought like it'd be quite, just quite interesting to explore like three different ways of thinking about pottery classes. Just so you don't think like I'm doing it wrong. If like you haven't produced anything, if you've been going to classes for like 5 years consistently every week and then like you never made anything, that's very unlikely, but that hasn't been a waste of time because like it's all about like the thing you're making at the end. So I thought let's talk about that and like talk about more about like three ways to use a pottery class. Okay, so the first thing to say is that there are obviously like different types of pottery class. So um, I initially went to pottery classes where we had like more defined projects. So it was like, okay, everyone, we're going to build like, like a pinch pot or something, or like we're going to hand build like a certain thing, like a slab pot. And then it was like a kind of skill based kind of class. And then as I kept on going, I was more kind of like, I guess I had those skills and I was more like independent in terms of like, I could kind of go and I could just use the facilities and kind of like make what I wanted to make. So classes might, for you, if you're attending classes, they might like move into more of a kind of independent making type kind of practice. Okay, so the first way that you can use a pottery class is like outcome focus, I've called it. So that is when you're doing a specific project. You go in with like a specific idea of either what like the teacher wants you to make or like what you want to make. You're like, you have this objective, like I want to make a mug for a cup of tea. I want it to be like nice and big, so I could like drink that cup of tea over a lovely like 15 minutes sort of relaxing time, and you've got this vision in your mind of exactly what you want it to be. So that's like one way of using a class is to go in with a really specific objective, or like the teacher might have a really specific objective, and then you're like working towards that thing, and like that's the outcome you want. So that kind of like really shapes like what you're doing in that class. You're going to be asking questions about like how to make that specific thing. You're going to be building your technical skills in terms of like what making that specific thing. Say for example you want to learn how to do like your mug handle, that could be like a very specific way of like learning those skills. You're like, I want to make my mug, I want it to have a handle, show me how to do a pulled handle. That's what happened to me once. I was like really seen, I've seen people pulling handles before on TV or something, and I was like, I want to teach me how to do this, I want to do it for my mug. And so it was very outcome based, the skills I wanted to learn. I wanted to have that thing at the end, a specific thing. Okay, so One way is outcome focused. Okay, the next the way that I found that I would use pottery classes, and this was like slightly different, was that I've called this way like inspiration focused. So this was when I wasn't really sure what I wanted to make, but I would kind of use it as like a kind of space just to be creative and like play. So I would kind of go in. I was mainly like hand building stuff. This was mainly when like I hadn't really thought about, like, what I was gonna make, like, before I'd gone in, so I hadn't thought, like, oh, I didn't have, like, an objective. I just kinda went in and I thought, "Oh, I've got a pottery class now." It was like, say, for example, like, in the evening, I used to go, or yeah, after school, I used to go as well, and, like, sometimes at the weekend, I used to go, and, like, it was like I used to go and I'd just be like and they would be like, "Oh, okay, so, what do you wanna make?" I was like, Not really sure," and I would kind of just, like, play around with clay, and that was really, really fantastic for, like, sort of helping me develop like different skills, like especially like for hand building skills, because I would be kind of like just messing about with like different sculptures, different like just hand building techniques, sort of pressing things into the clay, like just seeing what things looked like, smoothing the hay, just getting to know clay really, and just sort of playing with the medium. And it was really, yeah, it was a really good way of like kind of building up my skills. But like I said, that kind of resulted in kind of not really like an end kind of thing at the end. So yeah, so that's inspiration focused. So another way you can use kind of inspiration focused classes, I suppose, if you think about it in terms of I'm getting inspired in this class, I don't necessarily have to like produce anything, is that you can look at what other people are doing in the class. So that's what's so nice sometimes about like doing some kind of creative activity in a space where other people are doing the creative activity. So actually the class I used to go to had like during the day they had people studying sort of like recognized qualifications in ceramics during the day, and you'd see all their stuff. It was in a slightly separate area of the pottery studio because they were like, we want to keep this stuff like away from the evening class people, because like it was sort of really different in terms of like what they were doing. They were kind of doing it every day, and they needed to like cover up their work and make sure that it was like ready to go the next day so they could continue working on it. And so they had a sort of separate section that was all kind of for their stuff and things. And that was so interesting because they would often make like much more like ambitious and like long-term projects, than you could really like do in an evening class. So that was really inspiring. So that's another, yeah, way you can use a pottery class is just get super inspired by like other people, like what they're doing, and also other people attending your class. They might be sort of have like I guess like more years of experience or something, or just have a really different style of pottery. And so it's like it is like super interesting to like see how they do their work. Everyone is so different in terms of like how they make their pottery, and it's just like really interesting to see the different kind of styles and techniques that go on like in a pottery class. So yeah, second is inspiration focus. I'm just interrupting this episode to tell you about a totally free guide I've made just for you on how to make a stoneware pottery glaze. So, if you've never made a glaze before, or if you make loads of glazes and you just want a recipe, this guide is for you. It tells you everything you need to know, and it's available via the link in the show notes. Let's get on with the episode. For a pottery class. And then the third way you can use pottery class is practice skills. I've put this practice skills focus. So this might be like I would recognize that I was doing this in some of the classes I would attend. That I would be sort of again, I would feel like I hadn't really like made anything, like produced anything. But what I was doing, say for example, if I spent one class like practicing on the potter's wheel, I would realize, and then, and there'd be quite often where I'd be practicing, and then like everything would go wrong, and like everything I touched, like just seemed like wouldn't center properly, or like flopped over, or I was like overworking it, or like I'd accidentally knock it, and then it was like wiggly pot. There's a cut it off, start again. And so there would be like just some weeks like that where it was just like nothing worked. And so I my brain was sort of like, oh, this is really frustrating because I'm not going to have like an outcome of this pottery class kind of thing. Nothing to show for like all the kind of effort that I've been kind of, practicing. But then yeah, that's why I wanted to put this in this episode, because it's like, actually, if you think about this in a different way, it's like a practice focused class, that you might be doing, like, on that week sort of thing. So you're like basically improving your technical skills, you're learning the limits of the clay, you're you're like learning the limits of that specific clay, that specific like viscosity. It might be, say, like a wetter version of the clay that you normally use, and you're sort of seeing how that works on the wheel. Or you're seeing how it works if you bring a pot up really, really high. Like, how high can you bring it up before it like collapses? Or so it's like you can spend that time really stretching your kind of your knowledge, your sort of, it all kind of goes into your like almost like muscle memory of like unconscious like way that that clay likes to behave, on the wheel, or like the speed of the wheel, for example. Like, you're practicing with all of those things, like how much water you're using, like where you're putting your hands and things like that. So yeah, a practice based way of thinking about a class. There's so much going on in your, like I said, your subconscious, your conscious mind, your like your muscle memory, like, all the things, all the knowledge that's going in there, and sort of like um just going into your technical, like your bank of technical pottery skills. That's what's happening in that kind of class. Like, so just to say, like, you don't have to go in with a focus in mind. Well, oh, today I'm going to practice and everything's going to go wrong. You might be practicing and then you might get a pot that like works at the end and you're really proud of it and stuff. But like, and also, these things might be happening simultaneously in a class. You might make something and then have like a period on the wheel where you're sort of practicing. Or, you might be getting inspiration and then you end up making something, or and then it's become sort of an outcome focused class. So it's like all these processes, these three different sort of types of like, ways that classes can be used, are kind of all intermingling all at kind of at the same time during like one particular class. One particular class session can have all of these aspects in. But I just thought it would be a really good episode just to kind of really stress that you don't need to have like produced a pot at the end of a class to kind of, consider it like, for example, a success. Inspiration is happening, improving your technical skills, practicing is happening, and, or you might be working on a specific project. That's all happening, and it's all right, and you're doing it right. And yeah, enjoying your pottery class is the kind of the main objective, really. And just, yeah, just like being really gentle with yourself, really super kind, and just knowing that like it's all happening perfectly. And even when it feels like you can't do it and you're like not learning anything, that is not true. That's just a thought. Yeah, so thank you so much for joining me for this episode. It's been lovely talking to you about pottery classes and yeah, three different ways to use pottery classes. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me. And I will see you on the next episode. And until then, wishing you very, very happy potting. And I'll see you soon. Goodbye. Thank you so much for joining me on that episode. And if you want to find out more about eco-friendly pottery, head over to the Oxford Clay website, which is www.oxfordclay.co.uk. Can't wait to see you there.